Good day, and a hearty welcome. I had decided to dig a bit deeper into the possible location of this mine shaft. History told me was dug by the descendants of the land grab family. The family had settled into the Oasis Springs area in the 1800s, and had become quite prosperous by overtaking the early settlers to the area, by legal, or as was more often, shady business practices. I was not interested in such histrionics, but I was in the mine's location. Mrs. Landgrab was a striking, beautiful woman, and she cheerfully invited me to sit and chat with her about her family. She divulged her late grandfather was in the shipping business, and had travelled extensively. She said he had even ventured across the pond to England and the Scottish plains, where he indulged in learning the game of golf. I told her I did not play the game, but would like to acquire the skill when I eventually retired. We talked for the better part of the afternoon. She did provide me with one bit of valuable information. She did not own a map of the location of the mine, but her family had dealing with another family in the area long ago. That family, the Spencer Kim Lewis family descendants, were business partners around the turn of the century in question. Perhaps they may have some information about the location I was searching for. I made my way to the Spencer Lewis Kim household for a round of questions, and possibly the map I was seeking. Their home was, again, quite impressive, and I was a bit humbled by its stature. The owned, Mrs. Kim herself, allowed me an audience with her, and we spoke at length on the topic of her ancestors. She had just previously spoken to Mrs. Landgrab on the telly, and she was sure she had an old map in her family heirlooms collection. She said she would forward it to me as soon as she could find it, and I gave her my internet mailing address. Pootysims@simworld.com. We discussed further topics we shared, and I found the experience with her most enjoyable indeed. But I wondered if I was finally inching closer to my goal of crushing this grilled cheese addiction affecting my Sims. I saw this scourge oil end, and I would be its demise, or at mine. I returned to my domicile and my Eliza. I went to check on further information and awaited my mailing from Mrs. Kim. Eliza came to greet me with her usual smiling greeting and bade me to fell the little one we were awaiting. We preferred to not know its birth sex, as the kids are prone to do nowadays. Whatever he or she may be, we were excited to have the new addition to the family. We again discussed the case, as we previously did daily since the case became my obsession. She warmly declared I would soon be on the scent of the culprit. So I had no further need to raise concern. Bless her little cotton socks, she was a dear. I went to the post box again to check on any notices, and found, to my delight, our letter express from Mrs. Kim, with a copy of a map. The map had the location of the mine shaft pointed out with a handwritten notation and an arrow for direction. I left immediately for Oasis Springs. I made my way into the desert, and I must admit that I became quite lost as I searched among the sage sand of the area. I did locate a nice fishing pond nestled between the hills, and made note of it for possible further use. My search eventually paid off as I did locate the opening of an abandoned mine shaft. It was boarded up now with old lumber, yet the application seemed fresh and rather hurried in construction. I was intrigued by the hurried craftsmanship of the blockage, and wondered why, if having been open before, it was now guarded to allow no further access. I immediately took to the task of removing the boards, and, after succeeding in that, I prepared to enter the cavern. It was dark and very narrow, but I felt this might be the break if was anticipating. I armed myself with my service revolver, steeled my nerves, and entered the cave. Once inside the dimly lit cavern I could see my endeavor had been in vain. Whoever was using the cavern for the manufacture of grilled cheese had since made a rather hasty retreat, taking any quantity of the drugs with them. All that remained were the cooking devices needed to manufacture the drug, and various abandoned crates that once held quantities of bread and butter, but I was too late. I had a momentary flash of my intuition again, and it reminded me that somehow they may have known of my imminent arrival, and fled the scene. I left the cavern, but managed to secure some rather small samples of evidence that I would examine more closely back at headquarters later. As I emerged, the bright sunlight of the desert blinded me a bit, and I stood waiting for my vision to clear. The fume of the desert heat rose from the ground to hover in the air like waves. It was not a pleasant atmosphere. I called in my finding and with the help of my GPS in my phone, directed officers to the scene to process it further. I returned to the station and set about further examination of my samples that I had collected in the cave. Small bits of what might turn up to help further inquiry. I dutifully inserted the sample into the department's gas spectrum micrometer machine, a rather large and quite intimidatingly behemoth of a machine that used a variety of lights and gases to break down the individual components in the samples. It would take a bit to allow for proper analyzation to occur. So I made do and entered the data required for access, and started the process. I was keen to learn if perchance traces of anything might allow further investigation. Again, I might even, with a bit of luck, find a DNA sample, or some other type of clue like you see on the telly shows. But this was not a show, this was a very real SIMS. I was almost to receive the results when a piercing scream resounded through the station and I ran to see what had happened. To my horror, a young officer lay dead on the floor of the office room. He had collapsed and died that very moment, from what appeared to be overdose of grilled cheese. He had recently detained several young people for possession of the drug, and after seizing it from there, allowed that to depart with a stern warning. He then placed it in his shirt pocket, and from that, had contact, and from that, had died. Such a waste. With a saddened heart I returned to my task. Such is the duty of civil service to the public. I had witnessed so much death as of late, but I did not succumb to the temptation of nonchalance. It would always affect me. The technician in the lab looked over the results and concurred with me. Its samples did in fact contain traces of fine creamery butter, bleach white bread and several smaller traces of a low-grade cheese, possibly American. I took the results and went to discuss them with the chief inspector. He was keen to listen and told me to continue in whatever manner I saw fit. He added that, despite the young officer's mishandling of the drug he had confiscated, he was a rather thorough lad. He had dutifully recorded the names of the individuals he had released in his daily notes. One name stood out. One stood out to me in particular. A Miss Cassandra Goth,